I came across a fascinating story a few years ago. It was a study, in fact. 5,000 people were asked the question what they considered to be the single most powerful word in the English language. The most powerful word. Among the answers were words like love, betrayal, God, and purpose. But there was one story, there was one word that was far more common than any other. It was the word, I gave you a bit of a precursor, story. The word story was the most common. What is a story? It's not just a recounting of events. A story is, yes, a recounting of events, but more so than that, it is a structure. It's a way of ordering events and ideas into a narrative that makes sense to us. I had finished this book on Saturday, one of my favorite books of all time. It's called Mythos, written by an author by the name of Stephen Fry. And this book is simply a compilation of Greek mythology. And it made me realize, I was awestruck by how common many of the stories written 2,000 years ago are in society today, in media, in messaging, in movies. In fact, we as humans, whether we realize it or not, have a profound and deep reverence for story that is just built into our human condition. And today I want to take you on a little adventure as we briefly cover the language of story. And I want to give you a framework that can help you use stories to be more impactful in your life. It was the 1940s, and there was a gentleman by the name of Joseph Campbell. And Joseph Campbell gave himself a darn near impossible task. He was going to try to read and review every story, myth, legend, every major story, myth, and legend in the history of humanity, in order to try to find if there was a pattern between the myths of the ancient Macedonians, the Chinese legend and lore, the text of the Native Americans. Was there a common pattern between the stories that these cultures produced and passed between generations? And it turns out that there was. In fact, he talked about this in his book, The Hero's Journey, or his book was actually called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he introduced the concept of the hero's journey. He called this the monomyth, the core story that seemed to surface across every culture. And this story template has been referred to as the hero's journey, a concept that many of you perhaps have heard in passing. And I'm not going to cover all 12 stages of the hero's journey, but the core narrative of this story template is you as the hero, the protagonist, being taken from your ordinary state of events, being met with some kind of hardship, facing the call to adventure, rejecting that call, meeting a mentor, being thrust into an unknown realm, and meeting adversity, hardship, succumbing to temptation and loss, facing fear, failing, facing fear once more, and finally vanquishing that fear, becoming transformed in the process. It's a very detailed, cyclical structure that hearing out loud might bring to mind many films that follow this template. Films like Star Wars, The Matrix, The Lion King, even franchises like Harry Potter are built and use the hero's journey as scaffolding for their world building. There are over 200 major films that use the hero's journey framework. In fact, most notably, George Lucas had met with Joseph Campbell and had presented the Star Wars story script that he was working on and said, how can we make this one of the most powerful stories in the history of the world? And we have the Star Wars plot that perhaps most of you are familiar with today. Of course, not every story leverages the hero's journey. There are many ways to reorder and rearrange these stages to present new meaning. But it really does beg the question, why are we so fascinated with stories? Isn't it interesting that every culture seems to fall back on these core components? I think it speaks to our human condition, our universal desire for purpose. And it beautifully illustrates the common imagination that we all have. In fact, stories are nothing but our attempt to make sense of the world around us. There is a very fascinating idea where the story is that attempt to order our events and ideas. And in doing so, we take these stories and we apply them to different areas of our lives. We have to. Politics has a story that we like to apply to it. Whether it's one we invented ourselves or one that we absorbed from others, the events of the world are moving in a certain direction. We have a story for our beliefs, and there's also the story of our life, arguably the most real story to us. That story of our life is the focus of us as the protagonist. And are we not the protagonists of our own grand adventure? An adventure that is characterized by periods of richness and liveliness, but also met with times of dullness, dryness, and defeat. One of the most impactful lessons I've ever been taught, and something I carry with me in my mind to this day, is to never compare the troughs of your story to the peaks of someone else's story. Because our stories are so vastly different, and we're all on different journeys. I want to give you a framework, a story structure that you can use in your life to enhance the process of storytelling. It's called the PERM framework, P-E-R-M. The P stands for purpose, or the P stands for platform. The platform event, E is for event, R is for resolution, and M is for meaning. Platform, event, resolution, and meaning. Very simply, the platform is the ordinary stage of events. Think of a calm ocean that is almost ripe for disruption. The event is the change. What happens? What is the ripple that starts to cause the waves to become tumultuous? The resolution is how you deal with that event. And finally, meaning is how is your outlook now different in life? How have things have changed? I'll give you a final example to illustrate all this and wrap up this speech. It was Saturday morning, this is the platform, and I was reading a book on my deck, realizing that I had not yet prepared a speech for Toastmasters. I'd completely forgot. I was ignorant throughout the entire week, and I realized that I had a speech due in 2 days, and I had no material, nothing, nada, zilch. I had nothing. That was the event. The resolution, I decided that I would speak on something that I was familiar with. In fact, I was going to speak on the book that I was reading, which was the book Mythos I mentioned earlier. And I spent the morning writing that speech, memorizing the speech over the weekend, and finally, meaning, I delivered the speech, and in the process was able to speak on something I was learning and advance my skills as a storyteller and a speaker. Mr. Toastmaster.